This episode of the Albany Made podcast is devoted to New York State Library Advocacy Day, which is coming up on Wednesday, March 1st. In addition to answering reference questions, recommending books, providing digital literacy help, reading to kids, and recording podcasts, librarians voice their support for state funding every year. And on Library Advocacy Day, library staff and library lovers from around the state descend on Albany for a day of action. This podcast features interviews from two of our greatest library champions. First, we'll hear from our very own director, Scott Jarzembek, talking with Rebecca Smith-Aldrich. Rebecca, in addition to being the coordinator for library sustainability for the Mid-Hudson Library System, is a library consultant on sustainability and has developed library sustainability initiatives on the state and national level. Our second interview features our head of East Branches, Rebecca Lubin, talking with Mike Neppel, the Director of Government Relations and Advocacy for the New York State Library Association. Mike is also a member of the Albany Public Library Board of Trustees. A message you'll hear in both interviews is libraries are education, and it's such a strong message that we thought we'd give this episode that title. So if you see a large group of nerdy-looking people at the Capitol Wednesday, be sure to give us a shout of support.
Rebecca Smith-Aldrich currently holds the position of Coordinator for Library Sustainability at the Mid-Hudson Library System in New York, where she assists 66 public libraries in the areas of governance, management, funding, and facilities. She is active in the New York Library Association, co-founder and co-chair of the NYLA Sustainability Initiative Committee. For many in the library community, she is a respected professional, a pathfinder for libraries in New York State in respect to politics, funding, and governance. So most libraries get their funding from a local level. Why should the state even bother funding libraries?
I think because most taxpayers expect their tax dollars to be spent wisely. So libraries are pretty smart organizations, and we've learned how to leverage dollars to make sure their money goes as far as possible. So back in the 1950s, they created a structure called systems, library systems, where libraries were smart enough to figure out how to work together. But to make those systems work, the state invests the money because the state actually created those organizations. So because of that state money gets invested at a system level, that translates into services at the local level. So the local money goes a lot further because that state money is leveraged on the local taxpayer behalf. So, big example, most library systems, which are primarily state funded, actually are funding the backbone of your online catalog, or how you can check books in and out electronically, or how you can search databases or borrow things online. That's something that no one library usually can afford to do by themselves. So 21st Library Century Service is actually made possible by that state investment in local libraries through their local library system. So the cool statistic we always like to share is that for every $1 in state aid that gets invested in libraries, you see $7 worth of services at the local level. What taxpayer wouldn't want a 1 to 7 return on investment? So I think that's why the state money is so critical to the local level, because it keeps local costs down. It makes sure the whole burden isn't on the local taxpayer. Their state taxes get used to benefit them directly. So it's really smart use of the tax dollar coming from the state level and making sure the local people really benefit from it.
One thing that I've been hearing this year is, and in years past, is the idea that libraries are education. What do you mean by that statement? And are you afraid that some schools and teachers may take issue with that statement?
Well, libraries are education because they're actually chartered by the state education department. We're overseen by the Board of Regents, just like P through K schools are, K through 12 schools are. So, just from a definition standpoint, we are education. We're overseen by the education department. We're actually what are called education corporations, just like schools are. So technically we are education, but pragmatically we are education also. We are the people's university. This is where people come when they're outside of school, or if they're non-traditional learners, or people who want to learn about tech and were old enough not to be introduced to tech during school. We are teachers. I know people always are surprised sometimes to find out out that librarians have master's degrees, but it's because we're educators. We're educating the masses on how to use technology. Parents, how do you actually help your kid get a great start at school? We're educating people wherever they happen to be in life, and we're outside of that formal education structure. So to answer that first part of the question, we are education because that's what the law says we are, and also because that's what we actually do. We're educators. As to being worried about teachers in schools thinking we're competing or borrowing their phrase of being educators, that's not been my experience. I have a lot of friends who are teachers, and most of them are real fighters for their students. They want their students to have the best possible chance, and they see librarians and libraries as their partners in that. They're the ones that are saying, hey, go to the library, look for help for your homework, or when you don't have a computer at home, go to the library. That's where you're going to fill that tech divide for communities that don't have wealthy pockets at home. So I think teachers in particular really see libraries as the partners that they are. One of the best examples is the summer reading program that public libraries do, and school librarians love that because they see what the benefit is to the child. They call it the summer slide. When kids don't read over the summer, it means the teachers have to work that much harder in the fall to get those kids back to the reading levels they were at in the summer when they left. So we're part of this kind of puzzle of education, the puzzle pieces of education that it takes to really make a kid successful. So I don't know. I think we're partners in education. Most of my friends that are teachers agree. So I don't know. Are you hearing pushback on that issue?
No, I just figured it's a good question to put you on the spot.
Thanks, man.
So you travel across the state. What are some of the more compelling stories you have heard from the public about the effect of public libraries on their life and their community?
Ooh, that's a great question. I do get to go around the state a lot, and it's one of the best parts of the work I do. I get asked to come speak or explain how things work in New York, and a lot of my work I do is basically focus groups with members of the public. Sometimes they're people who use the library. Sometimes they're people who don't use the library, but oddly enough, I become fast friends with people the minute you ask them, what does the library mean to you? And I actually thinking through, I have hundreds of stories I've heard over the years, maybe the past 15 years I've been doing this work, from people who learned how to read as an adult at their library because someone was kind enough to take the time to help them figure out how to make that happen as an adult. It's a very difficult thing for someone to admit as an adult, I don't know how to read. And the same thing we're hearing with people who don't know how to use tech. They don't understand technology or the internet, or how do I get involved in Medicare? My own parents were really having trouble figuring out Medicare until they went to a program at the library. But really, some of these stories are absolute tearjerkers. People who found a job thanks to the library and dug themselves out of poverty because of the library. Places where that's the only place, what's one guy once said to me, it's the only place where people are human to me, where someone smiles at me and treats me like another human. Sometimes for an older person, it's the only place where they actually talk to another person during the day. But I would say the most compelling story, as for most people, is probably my own, that I really saw it firsthand as a kid, that was my only access to technology, was through my local public library. And that changed our lives. My brothers and I, that was where we got access to tech, where we kept up with our classmates and learned how to read, where we actually increased our vocabulary and became better writers and got into college. It all traces back to my parents' devotion to the public library. So I just saw it so much in my own family. I think that's what makes me keep fighting for it, because of these stories we hear throughout. I know you get to see amazing things probably every day here at the library. So I think it's just that very human element that we're on the front lines of that individual story, which means we're creating stronger communities throughout New York, which is exciting because that's what it takes to be resilient, is to have communities of people that understand each other, know each other, respect each other, and libraries provide that connection for people, either to knowledge or other people, or that support network we all need at some point in our lives.
If a member of the public was interested in advocating for more state, federal, or even local funding for libraries, what should they do and how should they get involved?
So answer your first question first. What do they do first? The first thing they need to do is be articulate. They need to know their story and understand why it's important to them. Some advocates just have a knee-jerk and say, well, of course it's important. But if you can't articulate why it's important, it's difficult to convince somebody they should do something different on behalf of library funding, whatever level it might be, to vote yes at the local level or advocate at your county level, state or federal. So first, sitting down thinking for a minute, why is this important to me? And really understand why and have your own story ready to tell somebody, because that's the most effective way to be an advocate, is to talk from your heart about why something matters. In terms of where you speak and who you speak to, that's the next thing to figure out. So at the local level, I mean, you're obviously looking at your local library and figuring out how they're funded. You could attend a library board meeting, figure out if that library has a friends group that you could join, or at least sign up and get their newsletter, so you're keeping up to date on when the right time is to speak up and say your piece about why the library matters. At the state level, it's really easy because we have the New York Library Association. So they make it very easy to speak up on behalf of libraries. You can actually pop onto their website today, NYLA.org, NYLA.org. I say that too many times. So it's really easy at the state level. If you pop onto NYLA.org and click on the button to contact your elected officials, there's a custom letter. You can actually change it yourself if you want. About 2 minutes, you've sent a message to your legislators to make a difference. At the federal level, you're going to want to look at the American Library Association and speak up. But really, you can do it on your own, too, on social media, making sure your circle understands that you understand why libraries are important. It's really about grassroots in America today. And when people hear from their friends and neighbors that something's important, that means a lot more than hearing it from an organization or even an elected official. So just be proud of your love of a library and speak up. That's the most important thing. And then get a little savvy about it. Figure out when is the right time and who you should be talking to, and you'll make a difference.
What does a library-less world look like to you? A world without libraries. A very sad idea in my mind.
It's quite dystopian, I think. I think one of the things people often don't realize about libraries is that we are freedom fighters. We are fighting for you every day so that you have access to information and you have the same rights as everybody else in America to understand what's going on around you, whatever sector of the world that might apply to, whether it's politics or religion or the environment or economics. We want to make sure everyone has the same right to access information. And I think that particularly in the world we live in today, that we're hearing crazy phrases out there like fake news and post-truth and tweet-plomacy. These are strange times we're living in, and it's important that everyone really owns the right to inform themselves and think for themselves. And libraries have been fighting for over 100 years in this state to make sure you have that right and have access to information in an affordable way at the tax-based level. So I think a library-less world means that people are no longer going to have equal access. It means that people are going to be able to fool you more than they already can. It means that not everyone's going to have the same chance for a bright future moving forward. Right now, any family can walk through the door of a public library and change their kids' lives in a heartbeat. And I think that's the way America should be. We're supposed to be about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So if we're not supporting public libraries, we're really giving up on democracy in America. I may be sounding kind of extreme about this, but I've really thought about it because really, what isn't a democracy if you're not informed about the decisions you're going to make? The whole idea of democracy is that you're informed and you're making the decisions as a community. Maybe we're a very big community as America, but if you don't have access to information to make decisions, that's pretty insane. You can't make good decisions on behalf of people. So I do think it's actually pretty dystopian. I think it's very George Orwell, 1984, without libraries. It's just a part of that kind of the goodness in all of our communities, our libraries, and they are a reflection of who we are as a people. So if those go away, I think we'd have to take a hard look at who are we really as a neighborhood or as a country.
Fantastic. Thank you very much.
What is the New York Library Association and its role in advocacy?
The New York Library Association is a statewide membership association. We represent library patrons, librarians, library staff. And we are the oldest library association in the country. We just had our 125th anniversary. We work with the governor, the state legislature, the Board of Regents, the state education department and its component parts, and of course, library directors and library boards throughout the state to carry the message to both the governor and the legislature and state policymakers about the important role that libraries play in every community, but particularly urban libraries.
As far as advocacy goes, NYLA has been really great in supporting how to train any kind of librarians on here's how to advocate for your libraries locally and statewide.
I think one of the interesting things about NYLA is we are such, even though we are lucky to have a paid staff that engages in advocacy and other support for the profession, we really are a member-driven organization. So that allows NYLA to focus on advocacy at the statewide level. Also, help support those who would engage in advocacy on the local level, and for those folks to come together and share what works when they're talking to not only their local state elected officials, but mayors, town supervisors, city councils, county legislatures.
Libraries, our education was a big message these last couple of years, for a while now. Is there a different kind of focus now? Has the idea of libraries or education expanded when it comes to library advocacy?
All of the above, strangely. The libraries or education message was really just a natural outgrowth of the role that libraries play in the community every day. It's very easy to communicate and understand that libraries are a core part of the state's educational infrastructure. They're at the center of many communities. They're the only educational institutions that are open all year round, serve every member of the community, and increasingly are being recognized for the role they play in early childhood literacy. The programs that many libraries have developed have become critically important.
You just mentioned a couple of things that the governor has been really excited about that are connected to the libraries. However, in his latest budget, he's proposed major cuts to money for libraries. Can you talk a little bit about two that are really going to impact libraries?
There are two primary programs that benefit local libraries like Albany Public and library systems particularly. The state library aid program provides operating aid to the 23 public library systems, the 9 research and reference library systems that service university and special libraries, and of course the school library systems. That cut was $4 million. That leaves library aid currently a little more than $10 million below what state law contemplates. Under the law, it would be $102.6 million would be full funding. This formula was last adjusted before libraries became such a critical point of internet access, technology adopters and implementers. So we haven't been at full funding in nearly a decade. Libraries are still suffering from recession-era funding, and no educational program in the state budget has been subject to these kinds of austerity measures recently. The other program that the governor cut was the library construction aid program. Most of this money is going to renovations and upgrades. Many of these projects statewide are energy efficiency upgrades, increasing access to differently abled patrons. The governor's $5 million cut rolls back the first increase the program saw in nearly a decade.
That's really terrible, too, because libraries, you mentioned recession-era funding before, and that was really when we saw a huge jump in the use of public libraries because the library became a lifeline to getting internet access, getting access to print off important documents, taking job training classes. And so that's really when libraries became increasingly more important. And to hear that they haven't really been a major increase in funding since then is really terrible.
You bring up an interesting point there about how folks were using the libraries during the recession when, of course, everyone was under the economic pinch. But it's interesting. So NYLA has been conducting an annual poll through the Siena Research Institute. We just got our results back from the 2017 poll, and it shows largely the same thing that it showed the past 3 years, which is libraries are critically important for low-income households, for women, for communities of color. When it comes to simple job development for 25% of households in New York that earn less than $50,000 a year, the public libraries are primary point of internet access. That's a startling number, honestly.
We see that every day. People are waiting for the doors to open at all the locations, and the main thing is to get onto the computers and to get job help.
Absolutely. And it's the governor has proposed a couple years ago this new New York Broadband Initiative, but we've seen from these polling results that that's great and certainly very important to bring high-speed internet to every community in New York. Mm-hmm. But we're talking about availability there. We're not talking about access. Libraries provide that access for folks that can't afford the monthly subscription or the device to actually access the internet at home.
Just here at Albany Public, we provide not only the computers which physically sit in the libraries, but at all our locations, we have laptops that people can borrow to use within our branches. And we're also lending out hotspots so people can have wireless for a bit. So you're right, the access, it's great if you have all the cable, but the access is what's important, and that's where libraries come in. And beyond that, too, we can actually teach people how to use their devices also.
So important, so important.
Now, you've mentioned the things that the governor's proposing to cut, but you've also mentioned in the same breath that there are a lot of initiatives that he supports that seem to go hand in hand with what the library does. So what can people do to tell the governor, hey, libraries are important to us. We want you to treat them better?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And if I had a clean answer to that, I wouldn't have a job. So
you're not going to share?
Well, the flip side of that is I like to be successful at my job because when I am, libraries are successful, and that's important. We've done everything we can to highlight how libraries serve the governor's agenda. This might be a little inside baseball, but, I don't think it's any coincidence that the governor cut these, what are known as legislative ads, money that the legislature put in during the budget negotiation process. The 2 years most recently that he has cut those ads have been the year after legislative elections. So the argument can be made that this is simply a negotiating tactic by the governor. But when we're dealing with a state budget that is $162 billion a year, it seems silly to have to justify the value that is gained with $4 million, $5 million. This is not to be flip, that is certainly a lot of money. But in terms of the state budget, we're talking the equivalent of what you find in your couch.
Right. It's not much.
It is not much money.
And libraries really are well managed. We can get a lot for our money.
Absolutely. Libraries and library systems, and this is something that we constantly communicate with state policymakers. It's not something, honestly, that I have found that we really have to work to communicate with local elected officials very much because they understand how efficient their local libraries are in terms of the services they can deliver on the money they have. The state education department has estimated a 7-to-1 return in services for patrons for every state dollar invested. Library funding it's one of the most efficient programs in the entire state budget. And it also benefits every single resident of the state. So it's confusing that we continue to have to make this argument to the governor, particularly when we are models for policy areas that he has championed.
This is kind of stepping back a little bit, but what about the legislators? They're supposed to be there representing us and what the public wants. There have been some changes in the legislature as far as kind of library champions recently. How do you think that will impact?
That's something that's difficult to navigate, considering that we rely so heavily on our legislators understanding the value that libraries bring to their constituents. We're very lucky here in Albany to really have one of the most engaged and available legislators, great supporter of libraries, Assemblywoman Fahey, Assemblyman McDonald.
They've been fabulous.
Is also a tremendous supporter of libraries. They both have Albany libraries within their assembly districts, and they've both been great champions.
Assemblyman McDonald, I just saw him the other night at the Delaware branch.
Right.
Because the lieutenant governor came to visit a Girls Who Code program that we have going on.
That's a great program.
It is. It's a really great program. But both of them will always come to the library.
Yes.
When they're invited.
And I've found that to be true with most legislators. One thing that we preach to library directors who ask, what can we do to advocate locally? What should we be doing? And the best resource that anyone has in terms of effective advocacy at the local level is the library itself. But as you mentioned, we have had some changes in the legislature lately. Senator Hugh Farley, who served more than 40 years in the state Senate and was, no hyperbole, the greatest supporter of libraries in New York State, other than Andrew Carnegie. As a matter of fact, this is interesting. I did the math last year, and I did the math as I revealed earlier that I was bad at it.
Yeah.
That's why I went to law school. I let the computer do the math.
Okay.
Adjusted for inflation on both sides, Senator Farley was responsible for providing more money for the Library Capital Aid program than Andrew Carnegie provided to construct libraries here in New York State.
Wow.
It's crazy.
That's great. That's great. Now, it's one thing if you as counsel for NYLA or me as a librarian in Albany go in and say, hey, you should give money to libraries. We want these funds restored in the budget. We want them increased in the budget. Now, what can the mom who takes her kid to story time every day, or the person who we helped get a resume and they found a job, what can they do to help let the legislators know how important libraries are to their lives?
NYLA actually makes it very easy for individuals who use their local libraries to advocate for library funding. You can go to www.nyla.org/advocacy. We have an online advocacy center set up. You can find out the latest information on the state budget. You can view some materials that we use in our advocacy presentations. They're available to anyone. You're certainly free to print those out. But if you go to our online advocacy center, you can contact your legislator. There are some preloaded letters. You're certainly welcome to edit any of those on your own. It quite literally takes 20 seconds. And we will send that off to your state assembly person, the governor's office, your local state senator, and they've been very good about responding to folks who contact them about increases in library funding. We also encourage folks to call their state assembly folks and state senators, but anyone who's looking to get a little more involved in that, NYLA's annual Advocacy Day this year will be on Wednesday, March 1st. It's a pretty exciting day. I know, Rebecca, you've been in the past.
It's a fun time.
Yep. We engage in legislative visits. We go around and we talk to staff and members of the legislature. We have a rally at noon. And it's really a good opportunity to connect with other library users, with leaders in the community, with your local legislators, and really to allow your voice to be heard.
And I would also add to that, first of all, the online advocacy, Mike is right. It's so easy. You don't even need to know the names of your representatives if you don't. If you do, you can find them out at the library. But you don't need to even know them. You just put in where you live, put in your address, and it sends them right away, and then you get lovely emails back. So that's really easy. Also, too, I would say if you're ever at an event and you see one of the assembly members there, you can always mention libraries.
Absolutely. And, if a library gets an extra $1,000 from a state legislator who sponsors direct aid to that library, they're able to put on countless programs. You know, I've heard from state legislators
that funds a whole summer reading program.
Absolutely. It's incredible how efficient libraries are. It doesn't take a lot of money to have a huge impact.
It's true. Just a librarian and a book, and we can do wonders.
I love that.
There you go.
That sounds like a button. I need a T-shirt. We're going to have those for Advocacy Day.
We'll see those
at
Advocacy Day.
Right.
Or just a librarian. You could do anything. Just a librarian and a computer.
Yeah.
See what magic happens.
I have no doubt you folks are like the David Copperfield of the educational industry.
Well, I think that's about it.
Excellent. Thank you for having me on. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you for chatting with me. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks to Rebecca Smith-Aldrich and Mike Nepple for being guests on our show, and thanks to Scott Jarzambek and Rebecca Lubin for hosting them. The Albany Made podcast is recorded at Albany Public Library. Our engineer is Ryan Slowey. Producers are Sarah Clark and Dana Wilbanks. Our theme music is by Ryan Devine. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back in a few weeks with a brand new episode.